Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Philosophical Cafe, to the Friday Philosophical Cafe. Tonight we will speak of freedom, or perhaps of kinds of freedom, in the early modern, but also in the modern world. And for those of you joining for the first time, both on Zoom and on our YouTube channel, let me tell you just a little bit about our Friday evenings. Well, evenings in Bucharest, lunchtime in the US, and so on. We have people joining us from all over the world. We have two names for what we are doing tonight. The first is the Philosophical Cafe, and this signifies that what you are about to hear is a friendly and relaxed discussion over a cup of coffee, over a glass of beer, over a glass of wine, depending on what meridian you are. And we organize these Friday evenings or these Friday discussions on topics of philosophical relevance, because what we want is to bring philosophy to the public and kind of find a way to make philosophy relevant in the public sphere today. The second name for our enterprise is Philosophy After Dark. And this is taken to mean something both literally and metaphysical and metaphorical. Well, metaphorically, it means that our discussion will touch, at least in passing, the current situation, the global crisis we are living through. What do philosophers have to say about this? What do philosophers of the past have to say about the times in which we are living today? And tonight, most appropriately, we will speak about a philosopher of the past who did have something to say to our present day life, namely Spinoza. Our speaker tonight, our guest tonight is Mogens Laerke, who is a distinctive voice in early modern philosophy. And joining me in moderating the discussion is Alexandru Liciu, student in early modern philosophy. So let me first just say hi to Mogens. It's very good to have you here as a...
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Good, excellent. Yeah. Nice to meet you all.
I just wanted to say one little thing more, and namely that the discussion tonight is about freedom, about speaking freely, and about the freedom of philosophizing. But I think that it's important to mention that there are a number of voices in this discussion, and for the sake of playing a bit, we will represent each of us one voice. So Mogens is, of course, the voice of the expert. And I'm very glad that joining us tonight, there are other experts on the topic, such as Stephen Adler and Daniel Garper and other friends of the Philosophical Cafe. The second voice is the voice of the student of early modern philosophy. And I have asked Alexandru to represent this voice. And of course, there are other students of early modern philosophy among ourselves on Zoom, and also joining us on YouTube. And we are eagerly expecting their questions. And there is also a kind of third kind of voice, which is the voice of the educated reader, the general public. And my task tonight is to try to speak for this particular persona. So I propose we all assume roles, and when we ask questions, maybe we think which of these voices we are representing. Now, let me just give the floor to the discussant with a very general question. Namely, I said that we are going to talk about freedom, and in our title, there is what does it mean to speak freely? There is also a reference to Spinoza and freedom of philosophizing. So my first question would be, what does prevent us to philosophize? What is preventing our freedom to philosophizing in a world in which we live under the impression that most of us in most of our countries do speak freely? We are speaking freely tonight. Is there anything that prevents this? Mogens, please.
Well, of course, that depends on what you mean by the word freedom in this context. I mean, one of the reasons why I've been so interested in Spinoza in relation to this particular question is that he has a notion what it means to speak freely, which is perhaps a little bit different from what we would sort of what we sort of usually understand by it today. I mean, I think when people speak about, say, free speech today, what they think about is the kind of freedom that is sort of enshrined in the U.S. Constitution and in the First Amendment of free speech, which is basically the idea that you speak freely in the case where the governing authorities or the state does not put any restrictions on your speech. So if you are speaking freely, or you have freedom of speech when the government does not intervene in what you want to say. And in that respect, and that's how the freedom of speech is defended. And of course, today there are many discussions that turns around whether the freedom of speech should be protected, or whether it should be limited, or whether it should be whether say sort of nominal free speech is actual free speech, or whether I mean all kinds of questions of whether it should be restricted or not, or whether speech should be regulated or not, whether it be a good thing after all to regulate speech. And one of the things that at least Spinoza can help us with in relation to that particular question is he can sort of infuse into that discussion about freedom of speech an entirely different conception of what it means to speak freely. So Spinoza, he wrote this book called the Doctrines theologico-politicus, where he, which is basically it's from 1670, which is basically a book about the relations between theology and politics, and then it involves all kinds of other things. But it says in its subtitle that the aim of this book is to defend the freedom of philosophizing. Now, which he then does. I mean, the last chapter of the book is, and let's say the whole book is dedicated to this question, but the last chapter of the book is dedicated to demonstrating that it is to the advantage of a state to grant free philosophizing, and it is to the disadvantage of a state to prevent it. Now, this sounds very much like free speech, like a defense of free speech, and has been very often seen as if that is what it is, like one of the first sort of democratically leaning defenses of free speech in the way that we think about it today. But the thing is, when you start to take a closer look at what's going on in Spinoza, you'll realize that his conception of freedom is not a conception of freedom where, when you are free, that means that you are simply not prevented from saying what you want to say. To speak freely, rather, to him, means something along the lines of say, determining yourself what it is that you say, or being in command of what it is that you're saying. It's sort of, it's less a question of whether there's restriction from the outside than, well, for him it's more a question of whether you are capable, have control over what it is that you say, and whether the things that you defend and the things that you speak up for are things that you generally have a grasp of, is to your own advantage and things like that. So I think the first thing that we learn from Spinoza when we get to his book, that's very, very important for contemporary discussions, is that when he speaks about freedom of philosophizing, he's not speaking about whether the state or not should allow him to philosophize. He has a notion of whether the state should allow him to philosophize or not, but that's not a question of what he calls freedom. That's a question of what he calls a permission. And a permission is something sort of a legal framework that he establishes, within which people can what he then calls philosophize freely. But just the fact that you are granted a permission by the state to philosophize freely, or to engage in free public discourse, as what this actually means, just if you have the permission to do it, doesn't mean that you actually do it. So one of the things that Spinoza was very let's say, prescient about is this notion or this idea that if you let, let's say, if you give people permission to speak, there are certain conditions that must be fulfilled before they will use that permission to speak freely. And if those conditions are not fulfilled, they will use their permission to speak to not defend their own freedom or advance their own freedom, but rather the contrary. They will end up using their license to speak to bog themselves down in their own unfreedom. And that's one of the things, of course, and when you look at today, you know, public discourse, what's going on, you know, on Twitter and YouTube. And I mean, just go to any newspaper article today, and you go to the commentary section. You know, you go to an article in Washington Post, and you go down to the end, and you have, you know, 400 comments on that. And you can just see how people bog themselves down in the most stupid commentary you can imagine, and how it becomes more and more, not just stupid, but also more and more agitated and becomes sort of a public discourse where people constantly insult each other. And that's exactly the kind of situation that Spinoza was very clear about could happen if you grant people the license or the permission to speak, if the state does that, without at the same time creating the conditions under which they can use that permission to speak freely rather than the contrary, well, then we are in trouble, in great trouble. So, so what he can offer us, I think, is a whole bunch of analysis and let's say very sophisticated, let's say, analysis of how it comes about. On the one hand, how, say, free philosophizing, understood as a public sphere within which people exchange opinions, how such a public sphere can be manipulated, how it can be contracted, how it can be granted, but both to the benefit of people, but also sometimes to the detriment of people. So that's the reason why I think that it's particular for this question of free speech, where readers of Spinoza have often until now just seen him as, you know, as a defender of free speech in the contemporary sense. But if you get closer to his text and one get a better grasp of this distinction between license to speak, which is granted by the state, and freedom to speak, which is something, an internal conditioning of yourself that allows you to take control over what it is that you say. Well, in that case, I think we can derive a whole lot of good things from Spinoza's analysis for understanding what's going on in public discourse. I mean, that we see every day, like I say, you know, in commentary sections of the newspaper and so on. You know, yeah, in the op-eds, also in the newspapers and in public discourse in general. I mean, there's a good reason why Spinoza would be someone who could do this. I mean, it's also because if you look at Spinoza's own historical situation, let's say that the mid-17th century, when he was writing, it's the same as for Hobbes, but also for other writers, both in the English and in the Dutch context, for different reasons, is that what we will see there, that we have sort of the emergence of a first sort of rudiments of what you would understand by a modern public sphere. Now, so what is a public? Yeah.
So maybe before we go to that, maybe so something that pops up in your discourse is that people speak to their own interest, and my question would be, well, firstly, what does that mean today, and more specifically, what does that mean to Spinoza? If, for instance, we think about the natural right in Spinoza, which should be something like the right to be selfish, and from this we have to somehow build the state, the republic, a democracy. So I guess my question would be how does this selfishness, this self-interest, play a role in the act of speaking freely? I mean, if you are allowed to say whatever you want, what are you going to say? Why do you have to prepare our minds before being able to say whatever we want to say?
So you're right. That means so Spinoza is often considered in terms of natural right, understanding meaning by that you have the right that you have from yourself, independently of, let's say, of the state. He has this notion that your natural right is simply your self-preservation. So you have the right to do whatever you think is to your own advantage from natural right. So that's why we need a civil society, where we need civil right that will sort of curb that. Why? Because a natural right is such that if everybody goes around and do whatever they want from their own self-interest, we end up in something like a state of war, something like that, like in Hobbes. However, so Spinoza has sort of let's say he has a conception of how, let's say, how our own self. I think that's the first thing to say. I mean, there's two ways in which we can exercise that natural right. Either we can do it rationally, or we can do it not rationally. Let's say the initial situation that we find ourselves in is that we're not rational. That doesn't mean that we don't, and we will still do whatever serves what we think preserves our own interest best, or our own self-preservation. But the fact is, since we're not rational, we don't know what that is. So we will just seek whatever we desire, whatever is immediate to what we seems like is to our immediate interest. And this is what produces a whole lot of conflict. In the other end of the spectrum, Spinoza also has a conception of that you can be in a natural state with other people where everyone is rational. And in that case, if everyone is rational and actually understand what is in their own interest, he thinks there's no need for a society, because in that case, everyone will speak to each other, act towards each other in ways that serve each other. Why? Because what is most useful for a man is another man. I mean, he has a very clear idea about, if you rational think things through, you will realize that it's better to act well towards others, not deceive them, not do them harm, so on and so forth. It will be in your own self-interest to do so, rational self-interest. Now, let's say the reality of the world is, of course, that we always find ourselves somewhere in between those two extremes, a sort of a rational natural state and an irrational natural state. And it is within that, say, that medium that speaking freely becomes very important, because it is through, for Spinoza, he doesn't think that you can, say, elevate yourself into the kind of, from, let's say, from this first bad natural state to the good one, which is a very long process, that you can't do that on your own. You have to engage with others in sort of some kind of discursive interaction where you learn from each other. And that can only happen if you have a public sphere. Public sphere is the place where private people come together and talk to each other.
Oh, and let me just jump in with a very general question, trying to situate the problem, because, you know, one can say that almost every philosopher, for sure, a vast majority of the early modern philosophers agreed that human beings have a large irrational part in their soul, that they were only partly rational and they were acting only partly rationally. And they kind of try to explain this by attributing our acting irrationally to things such as superstition or prejudices or the idols of the mind, or, you know, you name it, our passions. And also, most of them agreed that there is a very big challenge in the face of the freedom of philosophizing, which results from the fact that on one hand, this seems to be a private activity. I'm doing it on my own, and I'm exercising the powers of my mind to get rid of the prejudices and exercise my reason and try to suppress my irrational part. But I cannot do this solely on my own, because this is a activity we do in common. Philosophy is something that regards us all and regards the community. So how would you situate Spinoza among the other philosophers who are trying to do the same thing?
So I think I said it before we started that I would situate Spinoza in this tradition through the notion he has of prejudice, and his notion of prejudice, at least in the book that we're talking about, namely the Doctrines theologico-politicus, is at least in the way that he formulates it. I mean, of course, there's his sort of historical backdrop to this, where he's considered, and rightly so, as someone who was trying to root out theological prejudices and so on and so forth in the mid 17th century Dutch public sphere. But if we take a more sort of systematic view on what it is that he's doing, you will always see that when you read his text, that he would always say coordinate his use of the notion of prejudice with another notion which is a little bit more original, which is the notion of preoccupation. What he says, he uses the Latin term preoccupar, so to be preoccupied by something, or taken up by something, or being sort of evicted. Or he says, those who are prejudiced have their minds preoccupied. What does he mean by that? Well, he means something like alienation. It means simply that that you are, as it were, evicted from your own mind. There's someone else inhabiting it when you suffer from prejudices. And what does that have as an effect on the way that you speak and on free speech and the freedom of philosophizing? Well, it has the effect, first of all, that maybe you may think that you're speaking freely, but in fact it's not, and the speech that comes out may also sound as if it's free, but it's not you who's speaking in your speech. So he has this notion of how freedom of philosophizing can be impaired in such a way that it's not the speech that is not free, but it's the speaker who's not, in the sense that it's someone else who's speaking through your words. It's something that speaks very much to say when I hear people who defend indefensible political parties today, or political figures, how they will simply repeat as parrots. Also a metaphor that Spinoza likes to use. They speak like parrots because they simply repeat what they heard, but there's no sort of reflection where they have, say, sort of rational reflected those things and made what they say, made it their own. They just become sort of a medium for something else, and that's one of the ways in which, if you think about, especially when we think about the American discussions about free speech today, and how some, especially on the left today, would say, oh, maybe we should sort of take a step back and try and control this a little bit, because there are so many people out there who think they're exercising their free speech, but they don't understand that they are maybe exercising free speech, but they're not exercising their own free speech. They're exercising someone else's free speech and just being sort of mouthpieces for something else. So I think this kind of political analysis of how say prejudice can sort of be analyzed down to this sort of alienation from yourself, or political alienation from your own mind, is a very nice and let's say sort of political extension of these long discussions that you were talking about, which is most about prejudice and superstitions and idols of the mind in previous decades, from Francis Bacon onward, which was mainly about conflicts, not between politics and theology, but between natural philosophy and theology, right? So that's one of the things that Spinoza does with the freedom of philosophizing, and also with freedom of philosophizing, and also with this analysis of prejudice, that he brings it in from a discussion sphere which was before mostly concerned with the relation between natural philosophy and theology, into something which becomes really political. Or maybe I can say one more thing about that, which is about the very notion of freedom of philosophizing from the outset, where it comes from, because it's exactly the same. There's the same mechanism. Now, the notion of freedom of philosophizing is not Spinoza's own. It's a notion that sort of starts to show up in the first decades of the 17th century, beginning with Italian natural philosophers. So I think some of the first occurrences you will find in Campanella and in Galileo and in Bruno and people like that, where freedom of philosophizing was first of all associated with the discussions around the condemnation of Galileo, where to have freedom of philosophizing was the idea that you should have natural philosophy separated or being independent from theology. So that's the first strict meaning of what freedom of philosophizing, or libertas philosophandi, means. It means the modern conception that the theology, they say the natural philosophy faculty should be independent from the theological one. And that was the same thing if you go to the Dutch context in the mid-17th century. I mean, they inherited this clash between natural philosophy and theology. You can see it, of course, in Descartes, but also in a whole bunch of other sort of philosophers, important philosophers at that time, in Johannes de Rey, in Herabord, and so on and so forth. And which has actually meant that some commentators of Spinoza have said, well, freedom of philosophizing is just that. It's just the idea that, at the university, the natural philosophers should be allowed to go around their business without interference from the theologians. So I don't think that's quite right. There is absolutely an aspect of that in Spinoza, but there's another one, and which is that there's another discussion that goes on in the Dutch context at that point, and that's the question of freedom of religious conscience. That had been going on in the Dutch Republic since the late 16th century. After it was sort of enshrined in the Union of Utrecht. So at the time when the Netherlands became a republic, that there should be freedom of religion in one sort of another, which was sort of a practical measure that had, because these were territories where you had all kinds of religions, they had to coexist in one way or another, and this was the best way to do it. So there was these discussions on what that actually meant to have freedom of religion, how far it should extend, what was really going too far, what was not, so on and so forth. And one of the I think great merits of Spinoza's Tractatus theologico-politicus and his conception of what freedom of philosophizing is that he takes these two conceptions of freedom of philosophizing as the separation of theology from natural philosophy, and then this conception of freedom of religious conscience. And then he sort of merges them into a one unified conception of freedom of philosophizing. And how does he do that? Well, he basically does that by taking the first sort of academic conception of freedom of philosophizing and taking it out of universities. Spinoza was not someone who worked in the university. All of his philosophical interlocutors were not people working in the universities. When they offered him a job in a university, he said no, Why? Well, he said no, because he feared that they would limit his freedom of philosophizing. And if you look at what does that mean, that would limit his freedom of philosophizing? Well, it had something to do with the fact that the guy who offered him the job, they offered him a professorship at Heidelberg, and the guy who wrote to him was a guy called Fabricius. He didn't really want Spinoza to take the job, so he put on all sorts of clauses to sort of make him say no, which of course he then did. And the clause he first of all put in there was that, well, you will be allowed to say whatever you want, but you have to, keep it at the university. And that was the one thing that Spinoza could absolutely not accept. So he said, "What does it mean that I have to keep? I have to keep my work at the university?" I mean, because his most important thing with freedom of philosophy, his freedom of philosophizing was to be exercised outside the university, in the public sphere, among the people that he knew and that he exchanged with, the kind of people that he was exchanging with at the time, most of which were sort of an upcoming new bourgeoisie, people who had earned a lot of money by being merchants and now had leisure to engage in philosophizing and in theology and in arts and sciences and so on.
So on this note, I believe we have one question on one commentary from Professor Daniel Garber.
Yeah.
Hi there. It's a pleasure to see you here.
Yeah, good to see you.
I want to suggest a somewhat different perspective on what it is that's going on in Spinoza, what it is that's going on in the period, and some of the larger issues that I think are of relevance now. I actually think Spinoza did think that the government, that it was in part an issue of governmental control of speech. And that I think he did actually think that freedom of speech, here I'm thinking of chapter 20 of the Doctrines, theologico-politicus, should be limited to philosophical, which is to say, not political matters. That the philosopher was wrong to interject his or her own ideas about politics into the public discussion, and that the state would be right to limit the speech of the philosopher. But the larger question, now bringing this back to the idea of a public sphere, I think that the way Spinoza was thinking was that the philosopher who participates in the public sphere should recognize that for himself or herself, that there should be limitations to what it is that they should say for the sake of the stability of the state. What I think is very interesting, though, is there is nothing, I mean, what this raises is the larger question. How do you shape the public sphere so that people act responsibly within it? Which is a question that I think that you raised at the very beginning. Now, what's interesting is I don't see in Spinoza really an answer to that question. But there was one in Hobbes, in the Leviathan, and the emphasis that Hobbes put on education. If you remember, he goes on at some length about how it is that people should be educated in the proper political philosophy, which is to say his, and how the universities should be reformed and should be teaching the proper political philosophy, that's to say his, so that they have in mind the importance of the stability of the state, the necessity of supporting the appropriate powers of the sovereign, and so on, so that while they may have their own private opinions, they don't say anything in public that would disrupt the state. And what's interesting to me, when you're thinking about it in this, and it seems to me that what it is that Hobbes is interested in doing there is what we would think of as shaping the public sphere, shaping a kind of morality and politics within the public sphere. It's interesting that you don't find that in Spinoza, or at least I don't find it in Spinoza.
So, okay. So I think Steve had a follow-up question on this, so I don't know whether you want to.
Yeah, I was actually going to push Dan's point a bit further, although ask for your view on something that's always troubled me in this. I think Dan's right that despite saying everybody should be free to say what they think, then Spinoza introduces this restriction, namely speech that tends towards undermining the sovereign's authority and the dissolution of the covenant is not to be permitted. Yeah. So on the one hand, you can imagine a reasonable defense of that, and yet it seems like it's the sovereign who's going to decide what's going to count as subversive speech. So if I were to go out into the street now and start yelling that President Trump's medications for COVID are making him even more mentally unstable, that would not be permitted by Spinoza, I believe. And that's troubling, because when you have a mad king, you would think that their freedom to philosophize, not in your sense of the individual's freedom to speak rationally, but permission to say what you think, would be in the best interest of the state. So I was just wondering, I wanted to push you, as Dan was, towards think what your views are. And this seems to be a limitation on the freedom of speech in Spinoza that troubles me and really makes him walk back a bit from simply saying everybody should be free to say what they think. Yeah,
I think that's right. So maybe I can take Steve's first and then come back to what Dan was saying. So this question of there are limitations on that permission that to philosophize freely that Spinoza recommends that the sovereigns should give. Those limitations. So I'm not so sure that it's true that when he says that you should not be allowed to say what undermines sovereignty, that what he means that in terms of the stuff that you can't say. I think it's more a question of there are places where you can't say it. So I think it's more a question of the appropriate context for speaking than a question of what it is that you're saying. So that's a solution. I mean, I think the way that Spinoza puts limitations, or that he puts limitations, and there are indeed important limitations on this permission to speak freely, is that he says, yeah, you can speak freely in the sense that anything can be said within that sphere of philosophizing freely, but that sphere is not everywhere. You can't say it anywhere. You can't say it. It's a bit like Kant. You can't do it in such a way that that's the idea of having a sphere of free philosophizing, that you have a sphere of public discourse where, let's say, the effects that your speech creates on civil society are, as it were, neutralized simply by the fact that it goes on within that dedicated, circumscribed public sphere, where it's said, here's the content that counts. It's not the effects of what you're saying. So I think Spinoza was someone who was very clear about the fact that whenever you say something, what you say means something, but it also does something at the same time.
He does say that it's speech that has a tendency towards action.
Yes.
That leads towards action.
Yes. So it is speech that has tendency towards action. And what he's trying to say when he puts limitations on the permission to philosophize freely is that he wants to circumscribe a space where say the effects of speech are neutralized, because when speech does something, you're acting within civil society, you're doing stuff, and when you're doing stuff and you're acting with your speech, in those cases, whatever you do is subjected to civil sovereignty. But when you get into this circumscribed public sphere, which he calls the sphere of free philosophizing, that's where you can see wherever, whatever you want. So I think that's the way that he's going. It's very much like Kant, isn't it? In the end of the day, but this idea that those important limitations that you put on free philosophers is not about content, it's about context. It's about where you say it. So I think that was my. So I think that was the first thing.
I just wanted to jump in with a kind of a question from the public, as I remind you that we also have about 40 people watching us on YouTube and so on. So before giving the word back to the experts, Mogens, are we an embodiment of an exemplar of the public sphere tonight, right now? And if not, why not?
Whether we are right now?
Yes, right now. Yes.
Well, sort of. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, so it depends on. I mean, yes. I think we are. I mean, the idea of what a public sphere. Of course, the notion of a public sphere is not Spinoza. Spinoza doesn't have a notion of a public sphere. It's my. It's not mine. It's Jürgen Habermas's notion of a public sphere. And Jürgen Habermas's notion of a public sphere is a very simple definition. It is a space where private people come together in public. That's a public sphere, and that's what we're doing. So yeah, it is. It is a public sphere. It doesn't. It's a small public sphere. So Spinoza always has this notion of public sphere. It can be very small. They can be very big. He's someone who has an ideal of participatory democracy. So his political ideal is such that he would want there to be a very, very large public sphere. I mean, there are 17th century limitations on this. He doesn't want women, but so that's not so good. But apart from that, if we put those sort of limitations, which are more sort of contingent to his theory, if we put them aside, his idea is that we want to have a very broad interface, a democratic interface between the civil government and the citizens, and that broad interface just is a public sphere. But there could be there be very small public spheres as well. I mean, so we are exercising a little sort of corner of it right now. We could also exercise it. I mean, we can even exercise it even when it's not permitted, couldn't we? So you will have places where free speech, where we're not allowed to philosophize freely, but people will do it anyway, won't they? So public spheres tend to pop up everywhere, and they tend to pop up everywhere in proportion exactly to the degree to which people are in fact free, which is not a question of what they're permitted to or not, but a function of what they actually have to say and whether they want to express themselves, whether they actually, because Spinoza has this thing that people can't hold their tongues, and he has a good, say, metaphysical and philosophical explanation of why it is that people, when they have taken possession of their own judgment and start to think for themselves, well, they just can't shut up, can they? They will say it, and they will necessarily do it, even if they're not permitted to do it. People will object. So public spheres pops up in all shapes and sizes, and yeah, I presume what we're doing right now is a tiny little corner of that. So, although it doesn't have to be about philosophy, it can be about anything, can't it? So, so maybe yeah.
Can I return to the question? I mean, about is it what you say or where you say it?
Mm-hmm.
That's an issue, and you can say things in the public sphere, or there are some things you can't say in the public sphere. But in addition to that, I think for Spinoza at least, it's how you say it, the intention with which you say it. If you say it on the basis of reason, just as a matter of fact, it's okay. But as he says, if you do it with deception, anger, hatred, or the intention to introduce something into the Republic on the authority of your own decision, then you can't, then you're not allowed to. Then there are restrictions. And the problem, I think, here is, when are you just simply asserting a scientific matter of fact? And when is it that you are saying something that is intended to be influencing the Republic. What Steve said before, the example of, well, I think Donald Trump's medical treatment has caused these psychological problems. Well, if that's just fact, then it's okay. If you're just simply saying it because you believe it's true on the basis of, medical science. On the other hand, if you're saying it as a critique of the sovereign, then it's not allowed. And the problem, I think, with Spinoza is, or with Spinoza's account of freedom of expression is, it isn't really clear. There isn't always a clear boundary between the two. Which gets back to the question, I think, of educating people to behave appropriately within the...
Absolutely. So, Dan, can I just sort of, because I wanted to come back to that. I mean, so on the back of what you just said, I think one of the important things to realize when this passage that you quoted, that you can say whatever you want, provided that you do it without hatred, anger, and so on and so forth. Yeah. The provision here that he establishes here, which is a provision of how you should behave within a public sphere, is not a legal one. I don't think it's about, it's not about what the state tells you to do or not, because one of the very important things about when you try to reconstruct what a public sphere is for Spinoza is that it's something which within the civil society remains regulated by natural right. The public sphere is not regulated, but it's circumscribed by civil right, but it's not regulated. What goes on within the public sphere is regulated by natural right, which has the effect that you can sort of express whatever you think is to your own advantage, and you will do it, whether it's rational or not. But it also has the unfortunate effect that when you create a public sphere, there's a sort of when you can say that's a big, nice democratic interface between the government and the citizens. It's all very nice, but there are disadvantages that can't be avoided in there. And one of those disadvantages is that all those things that he lists there, and in particular deception, cannot be eradicated by law, because it's regulated by natural right. And by natural right, you have the right to deceive as much as you want. And when you deceive as much as you want within the public sphere, as long as it serves your own advantage, by natural law, you can exercise your right in there in any way you want, including by deception. And that leads Spinoza in some, it gets him into some trouble, but also gets him into perhaps some of the most important, sort of most interesting bits that you can say about his conception of the public sphere, namely towards education. Because as you say, the only way that you can get rid of deception, and the other kind of deception is sort of a classic humanist commonplace that he deals with, is deception and it's flattery, political flattery. So how do you get rid of that? Well, you can't get rid of it by law. You can't ban people from, you cannot make laws against deception. De facto, you can't make laws against deception because you can't get into people's heads. But they say by right, you can't really do it either, because public discourse is not regulated by law that way. So the way that Spinoza goes about this is he say, well, freedom of philosophizing is, on the one hand, you have this dedicated space where you have the permission to speak, where you have the permission to speak freely. But at the same time, if you don't at the same time, when you give that permission to speak, you also create, say, the conditions under which people can learn how to do it freely. Then it won't work. And the conditions under which you can learn how to do it freely requires education. Now, you're absolutely right. I mean, Spinoza is extremely cagey about what his educational program is supposed to look like. I mean, he does say quite often mentions arts and sciences, that is essential, and so on and so forth, but he doesn't develop a real sort of educational program.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So maybe before we move on to flattery and passions and education, I think Professor Daniel Cook had or has a hand up.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear Dan.
Okay, hi. I'm having problems writing it. I wanted to ask you, I'm not a scholar of Spinoza. Did his personal situation, where I guess in effect he was kicked out of the Jewish community because of philosophizing or wanting to philosophize, did this personal injury and the timing of it affect what he wrote, and is the reason he wrote? I mean, there were others like David Hume didn't get an appointment at the University of Edinburgh, but I don't think it affected him, and he talked about it. I don't know, but what's the timing here? Is he especially interested in this topic, you think, because of his own personal experience, even though he liked to philosophize sub specie aeternitatis?
Yes and no. I mean, so I think, I mean, there are some personal experiences in there that are important. I'm not quite sure that the expulsion from the Jewish community plays a huge role in here. Steve has argued a lot for this unfortunate event with one of Spinoza's acquaintances, a certain Adrian Korbach, who died in prison because of a book that he published, and which is sometimes presented as a key motivation for the views that Spinoza holds in the Doctrines theologico-politicus, and there may be something to that. But overall, generally, of course, but there was something about his own historical situation, more general, of his general political situation, that was very important. I mean, if you get to 1670, when he publishes the TTP, this is a time where you have in Holland, you have a comparatively very liberal republic, a very free or tolerant society, but which at the same which had been there really, which had really peaked in the 1650s and 60s, but now was under increasingly under pressure. So that there was more and more theologians who were putting pressure on the government, and there was more and more sort of external pressure being put on the republic from the outside in terms of wars and stuff. And the fact of the matter is that the whole thing collapsed when we get to 1672. So this is the point. So Spinoza, I guess the most important personal experience, or what I would most highlight, is not, say, a personal tragedy, but more sort of a general societal situation where there were some freedoms or that he really wanted to defend because he felt they were important. And what he really felt was important was to defend free philosophizing. And what did he mean by that? Well, he wanted to defend the societal uses of the kind of intellectual communities that he found himself in, namely not university professors, not politicians, but private people who came together more or less in public to discuss public affairs, physics, whatever, all kinds of things. So, I'll just make one remark about something that Dan said earlier, which was about the notion of philosophizing. I think it's important that we realize that when Spinoza speaks about philosophizing in this way, rather than philosophy or natural philosophy, philosophizing is a very, very broad category for him. It can mean a whole lot of stuff. It's not just philosophers who philosophize, anyone philosophize. And a way that you philosophize is not necessarily something that has to do with concepts or with engaging in talking about things that you would normally associate with philosophy. It has to do with a particular kind of way of engaging with others. So that's also something that Dan Garber asked about just before, which was about, how do people learn to behave within this public sphere, and then this whole question of education. But there is the question of how should they behave? What does it mean to philosophize within the public sphere? Well, to philosophize just means that you engage with others in a particular kind of way. And you can talk about anything. And that particular kind of way is that you engage with them in a reasoning manner, with arguments. You engage with them with sincerity and candor. You engage with people in view of finding a solution to things. You engage with others on terms of equality. These are all very sort of simple recommendations of what is basically what you would call conversational decorum, which is a tradition that I think Spinoza inherits from the Erasmian tradition from the humanists. This idea that when you engage with others in conversation, or when you engage in public discourse as well, then you should do it with decorum. And free philosophizing just is a theory of decorum.
So maybe,
yeah.
So maybe the question that we should have asked and we didn't is, first of all, especially for the students and for the general public, who is Spinoza more specifically, and how many portraits of him can we have? Because, you know, for instance, in our department, we thought a very different Spinoza, something like Spinoza's modal metaphysics, or the more analytic kind of philosophy, which has pretty much nothing to do with political philosophy. So maybe before going to the issue of Spinoza's radicality, we should do a brief. We should have a brief talk about who was Spinoza.
Sure. So Spinoza is this philosopher who, in the 17th century, probably was the one who was the most scandalous. If you want to read about that, I mean, Stephen Adler's book on a book Forged in Hell is a very good exposition of how scandalous Spinoza was. And that was for two reasons. He has these two major works. I mean, on the one hand, there's the Ethics, which is sort of it's a manual to freedom, as it were, an ethical manual to become free, which starts out, you know, from basic ontology, what exists, and God, and ends up with it's almost sort of a recommendation of how to live your life based on this basic metaphysics. So that's the Ethics on the one hand, and which created a lot of scandal because it was clearly atheist. No, some people would contest that, but I think most people at the time at least thought that it was. And then on the other hand, we have this other book written about the same time, which is the Doctrines, theologico-politicus, which is about, you know, not about the individual path towards freedom, but about the collective path towards freedom of a whole society. So, and those two works entertain very complicated relations to each other. Some have felt that they were sort of disconnected from each other, in particular because of this question of what freedom is, because the Ethics, which is this thing about the individual path towards freedom, defends clearly and by definition a conception of freedom where it is about self-determination rather than just, you know, absence of obstacles. Whereas people then, in particular because of the free speech angle on it, they felt that the TTP was defending another kind of freedom, which was this more sort of negative, just, you know, do whatever you want sort of thing. I don't think that can be right. I don't think it is. That doesn't mean that these two major works by Spinoza are not, let's say that one reduces to the other, or one can be explained in terms of the other. They're more like two complementary works about, on the one hand, individual freedom and how to achieve it, and on the other hand, about freedom of philosophizing, which is societal or public freedom or freedom in the state. So he wrote these two books, and one of the let's for the discussion today that sort of sets him apart from most of the other political theorists in the 17th century is that Spinoza is arguably the first major, political theorist, modern political theorist, to defend democracy as the preferred state form. So he's the first, yeah.
Mogens, let me press you a bit here on the image of Spinoza, because one thing that Steve Nadler's book is teaching us is that there seemed to be a kind of general reaction in the 17th century that the theologico-political treatise is dangerous and should be banned. And we haven't said that, but it appeared anonymously, of course, and it put Spinoza in a lot of trouble, not only, with all sorts of communities. And that Stephen Nadler is making, Stephen Nadler's book is making a very good point, and a lot illustrating very nicely the way in which 17th century readers reacted with fear and worries to this book. And how does this square? Your presentation of Spinoza, the humanist Spinoza, seems to emphasize the communitarian aspect of Spinoza's philosophy, the friendship, the fact that he was speaking to the others and for the others. And this is, in a way, very different from a radical thinker who was kind of putting fear into the role of society, for example. And everyone was a kind of worried about this Spinoza, who is saying that the Bible is a literary text and we should get rid of all superstition and so on and so forth. And the book that even Hobbes thought it was a bit too bold for its time. How do you put these two things together? And maybe Steve can also jump in at some point and help us.
So I think there's one thing that we have to be clear about. So let's say that today that Spinoza, he's being hailed and sometimes for good reason, sometimes not so good, but on the whole for good reason, as being sort of a very modern and forward-looking sort of thinker in terms of defending, of being sort of an early defender of Enlightenment ideals of freedom and tolerance and equality and so on and so forth. And that for that reason, Spinoza in the 17th century, where everything was dark and medieval and, well, not exactly medieval, but, was dark and governed by the theologians, and then he became persecuted because he was a Democrat. No, that's not true. People were not particularly interested in his political theory or in his conceptions of tolerance and things like that. What they were interested in and what made them tick and felt that he was absolutely scandalous was basically two things. It was one, he denied miracles, and the other thing was he said that it was not Moses who wrote the Pentateuch. Those were the two big issues that people were really upset about. It was not because he defended democracy. So there's sometimes some sort of conflation between this sort of somewhat Whiggish celebration of Spinoza as a very modern thinker, and then sort of a coordination with that as him being persecuted for being very modern. Well, he was persecuted and he was very modern, but he was not persecuted because he was modern. So I think it's important to make these distinctions. And then another thing about it, actually, for me, I think it's very difficult to navigate these sort of, on the one hand, forward-looking, say, modern aspects of Spinoza, and then the backwards-looking one. What sometimes happens when you think of Spinoza as a forward-looking thinker is that you end up just seeing him as a sort of an early version of yourself, or an early version of your own ideals, or you end up seeing Spinoza as this. Someone like Jonathan Israel can sometimes have a tendency to do that when he speaks about Spinoza as sort of the forerunner and sort of the architect of what he calls the radical Enlightenment. Namely, he is the first sort of early modern architect of the liberal ideals that are governing our conceptions of liberal democracy today. So tolerance and free speech and so on and so forth. Now, I think it's to some extent true. On the other hand, if we just say that, we don't learn very much from Spinoza, do we? So that's one thing. And the other thing is that when you start to look at what Spinoza then says in his own context, rather than just see him as a precursor of ourselves, well, what you will see is that he's someone who not only has a very sort of forward-looking agenda, of course, and I have no trouble with saying that Spinoza is on questions of politics a forerunner of Kant and people like that, but at the same time, he also has this constant backward-looking agenda where he looks back to his predecessors in the humanists. And one of the things that I realized that if you read Spinoza with an eye on Grotius and on Erasmus and on Lipsius and on Eugen Burgard, and you look at all of these thinkers from the late 16th and early 17th century, if you read him with that kind of eye, you can get something out of him that's very interesting. Namely, you will see him as a very modern thinker who can tell us a lot about, democracy and tolerance and so on and so forth. But he's also someone who at the same time has spotted a lot of the difficulties that comes out of that. At the same time, he's very sensitive to, say, as I just talked about it just before, this idea, if you, he says, well, you have a natural right to freedom of judgment. Okay, that sounds very forward-looking, and it is very forward-looking. But on the other hand, he also has, if you look at it with the right eyes, very subtle discussions and conceptions of what are the disadvantages of that and how do we remedy it. So, for example, if we come to a point where we can say that freedom of judgment and freedom of speech within the public sphere is a natural right that you cannot be alienated from. I mean, it's not just a question of, that's his point of view. It's not just a question of that the authority to speak up for yourself is not just something that you should be permitted. You can actually cannot be taken away from you. It's simply just not physically possible or metaphysically possible. It's a natural right that you have to speak up for yourself. But he's very sensitive to the fact that this natural right to speak up for yourself comes with a whole lot of disadvantages and a whole lot of problems. And many of these problems that he detects with this are problems that have been discussed at length by humanist thinkers. So
So maybe before going to that, Professor Nader had something to say on the image of Spinoza, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, I like the way Mogens puts that point that when you read Spinoza, you see him as a forerunner of yourself. In fact, I would say that Spinoza is a kind of Rorschach test that everybody sees in Spinoza exactly what they want to see, which is a reflection of their own ideological persuasions. And so mystics see in Spinoza a mysticist, Zionists see in Spinoza a proto-Zionist, anarcho-socialists see him as an anarcho-socialist, classical liberals, radicals, everybody sees in Spinoza exactly what they want to see. But going back to this point about whether his modernity represents a kind of a danger, I think Dan has made a nice point in the past by raising the question of whether Spinoza should have published his philosophy. And to what extent could Spinoza not have been aware that the things he was saying, especially in the theologico-political treatise, but also in the ethics, could at least have the potential of undermining people's the faith and the obedience of ordinary people to God's law and as well to political law, if I remember Dan's argument correctly.
Yeah. So yeah. Of course, I know that argument, and I think it's a very nice argument. I'm not sure that that's. So Spinoza has these famous recommendations to whom he wants to read his text by the end of the preface to of the TTP, where he says this is a book which is dedicated or which should be read by the philosophical reader, as he says, by the philosophical reader, and he would rather that the common man should stay away from it because otherwise they will just interpret it perversely as they always do. So he sort of from the outset sets out whom he wants to read. It sets some limitations on whom it is that he wants to read it. So for this whole question of whether he's sort of undermining his own project by publishing his book, of course, there's a sort of de facto question of what kind of reaction it actually produced, and in that respect, I think to some degree I could agree with Dan. I'm not quite sure it had the effect that he intended. But let's say from the more sort of systematic point of view, one has to be sort of, it's a question. So it becomes a question of who is this philosophical reader that he wants to read. So the systematic question would be: would Spinoza undermine his own program if only the philosophical reader for whom he intended it reads it? So I think that's the philosophical question you can ask to this, rather than sort of de facto historical one. And in that respect, no, I don't think so. Because the philosophical reader, that's not because the philosophical reader is someone who is knowledgeable or no, it's simply because it's something who knows how to philosophize, and is someone who knows how to engage with this material, and part of or has acquired has acquired and incorporated these rules for how you engage in philosophizing. That means exchanging with others, and some of those I mean, the exchanges that Spinoza has with people that are certainly suffer from prejudices and things like that, and he doesn't need to get rid of them. That doesn't mean that they don't philosophize freely, or that it simply means that each of the persons that he engaged with, only what he expects of the philosophical reader is that they speak candidly and that they speak for themselves, whatever they say, and that's all there is to it. And maybe and also that they make their own judgment about what is said. He likes to quote Romans of St. Paul on that. St. Paul, who addresses the Romans, saying, I speak to you as brothers, judge about what I say as you will, or something like that. And that's the mode in which Spinoza addresses his book. You have to judge about it yourself. That's the only thing. Now,
but Mogens, let me just ask you: how does the philosophical reader that Spinoza has in mind acquires the qualities that are required to read that theological-political treatise?
Yeah. So now we're back full circle.
Is he supposed to have read the ethics?
No. It's not about, you don't have to read the ethics about. So that's the thing about philosophizing. It's not being a philosopher, and it's not about being a philosophical reader. Doesn't mean that you're a Spinozist, or that you read the ethics, or even that you read Descartes, or you read any philosophy at all. The philosophical reader is someone who knows the rules of engagement, and the rules of engagement is something you acquire through what? Education. So now we come back full circle to this question that Dan has. I think there is in Spinoza, and I think it's very right to take up that question, because Spinoza is so oddly silent about it, that his whole theological political setup, his whole political theory requires a philosophy of education. And I think it's in there somewhere, in very sort of rudimentary, way. But I mean, you can at least gain some idea of what it was. But the thing is that at some point where he says something to the effect of that this is not the right place to address this thing. So because I have I've kept this for another place. So it's something that often happens in Spinoza, and that is often overlooked. That he has various places around in his writing, places where he will say things to the effect that, well, it's not the place to say this here, but I have planned to say something about it later. And then he just never did, because he didn't have the time. But there are good indications throughout Spinoza's writing that he wanted to write a philosophy of education, or at least write about education. But he just never got round to it. So it's not just, if it is missing in there, it's not because he wasn't interested, it's just because he didn't have the time to do it. But what we can do, we can then start from that point of view to start to look at what might he have had in mind if he had had the time to actually do this. And then when we look at the context around him, there are people who were just in his very sort of close intellectual community, people who were very interested in public education. So they say his closest, what I think more probably is his closest parent is his teacher at the guy who taught him Latin, a guy called Franciscus van den Enden, who wrote a sort of a democratic. He's a nut. So when I just one thing before I said that Spinoza was the first major philosopher to defend democracy, doesn't mean that he was in the 17th century. He wasn't the first, because there were other minor philosophers who did so, and Franciscus van den Enden was one of them. And one of the things that van den Enden also did, at the same time as he developed this theory of a broad theory of democratic republicanism, was at the same time he also had a very elaborate theory of public education. A theory of public education where he thought that we should have broad public education that should be, say, paid by the state, but not controlled by the state, and that should take place in what he called community colleges, where students and teachers would engage with each other on levels of equality. He even talked about completely eradicating the hierarchy between students and teachers, and just having seminars where everybody was hanging out with each other and talking to each other based on the models of the kind of religious meetings that you will find among heterodox Christian sects in the mid-17th century, the people you call the collegians. So you have educational theories in very close to Spinoza, people who think about public education very strongly and as something that is a precondition for a democracy to work. So one could expect that Spinoza would have would defend similar views, and I think he does. It's just that he's being very he doesn't say much about it. I mean, one thing that is to say about education is that it would be very surprising if he didn't have anything to say about it, in the sense that if you look at the political landscape in the 17th century of Holland, ever since you had the republic that was created in 1579, the question of public education was key to the way that they managed the republic. I mean, they created tons of universities. The Netherlands were becoming more and more this center, or this nexus for education in Europe, and so on and so forth. And you had all kinds of different, also new and innovative ways of teaching people. I think so. At Franciscus van den Enden's teaching, he had his own little grammar school, so that was not a big deal. But there were big programs, for example, with what they called the illustrious schools, which were different from the university educations, but where you would have something like a liberal arts education that was both, on the one hand, was a sort of the education that was there to prepare you for university, a sort of a prep school, but at the same time was a liberal arts education that was supposed to teach you how to engage in public life. And how to be, you would teach you the rudiments of the classics, and it was very heavy on classics. So all this, this sort of educational discussion, or these public structures for new education that popped up in the Dutch Republic at the same time that we saw a new sort of bourgeois public sphere emerge alongside with it, was really something that was in everybody's mind. And in Spinoza's time. So it would be very odd if he didn't have anything to say about it. And I think he did have a lot to say about it. He just never got around to it. But I've spent quite a lot of time trying to recreate what he might have thought about public education. And one of the things that is, so just again, to come back to Dan, I'm just going on again. I saw, it's not a silly question. No, he was not there. So back to something that Dan said. Yeah.
Mogens, let's bring to the fore the discussion that was going on in the chat.
Yeah.
Because people watching us on YouTube do not know it. So in the chat, there is a long discussion about whether women can philosophize.
Yeah.
And maybe Joe wants to put the question and then bring it to the fore and then discuss whether Spinoza was married or not. Joe, do you?
Yeah, we ended up discussing whether he was married or not, but because obviously a lot of these people weren't. So I don't know if that had an impact on his views or he didn't want to. But anyway, I mean, the question was whether there was an implication in his writings on whether women could philosophize or not, and if I mean, did he say anything about this, and what was the profile of the philosopher, of the ideal philosopher, let's say?
So I don't think he says anything about whether women can philosophize. And then, no, he was not married. There are all kinds of anecdotes, but it's not. It's not something that I mean, yes, and it's clear that they say the question of women, if you look at Spinoza's text, is a problem. Spinoza does seem to have trouble with women and with sexuality and relations to women. But I mean, the infamous place is, of course, the last section of his unfinished political treatise, where he argues that women should not be engaged in public life. But the argument is basically that women should not engage in public life because they are too weak, or that they are sort of naturally unfit to do it. It's a terrible argument on all levels. I mean, ethically and morally and politically, but also simply philosophically, because he has no. I mean, there is no argument in there. So I think that's actually the redeeming factor of this. That you can say, okay, so Spinoza as a person, when it came to questions of women, he really had a problem here, but it doesn't affect his theory, because there's nothing in his philosophical views that warrant that. I mean, there's nothing philosophical that would warrant it. You can simply, I mean, he also, it's not just about women. There are other things where he's just peddling prejudices like everybody else at the time. When he speaks about Muslims, for example, it's the same thing. I mean, he presents all Muslims as people who are just sort of mechanical dolls who are subjected to the sort of religious political authorities of the Muslim world. I mean, so these things, I mean, you can sort of spot them and you can say, well, that's not good in Spinoza, but you shouldn't put his books away because of that, because there's nothing philosophical to warrant it. It's simply his peddling prejudices that were very prevalent at the time. So yeah. But about women, yeah, there's nothing. He doesn't have any particular to say about it. They're partly he's bad on philosophical things, I think. So
we seem to have been. Yes, Dan, please.
Just a brief comment about education. It would be very interesting to know. I didn't know about Vandenende's theories about education. It would be interesting to know what hints one could find in Spinoza about that. But it is quite clear that Spinoza did think that the majority of people could not get all the way through a book like the Ethics. Mm-hmm. And he says at the end of chapter 15 of the Tractatus theologico-politicus, that it's a good thing that we do have theology and obedience, because if people had to behave well on the basis of understanding through reason why they should, then very few people would be able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
But that may not say, but that's not to say that there isn't a role for education for those people, even if, strictly speaking, they couldn't become philosophers?
No, I don't. No, certainly not. I mean, he has this. I mean, I think we should not sort of saddle Spinoza with an idea of that there's sort of the ignorance on the one hand, and then there's the philosophers on the other, and then there's then they're sort of separated and forever. They're not, are they? So what Spinoza has is that he has this very elaborate framework to deal with the fact that nobody acts rationally all the time. Most people will act rationally some of the time, more or less. But in order to compensate for the fact that no one will act rationally all the time, and he has maybe two people who will act rational all the time. That would be like Jesus and maybe Solomon, but that stops there. So after that, everyone else is in a situation where sometimes we will be in a situation where we will act and we will speak and we will behave in ways that are not rational. But then he has put down, then you need to put down some ground rules for what do you do in such a way that people, even though they're not rational, even when they're not rational most of the time, will still behave and act and speak in ways that are rational. And the way that he does that is that he comes up with what he calls doctrines. And there are basically two kinds of doctrines. There are political doctrines and there are religious doctrines. Political doctrines and religious doctrines are doctrines that are placed and that people would have to be taught with emphasis on the word teaching, through education. It's basically kind of religious and civic education that they must learn, that these are things that they must abide by or that they must believe in. Certain doctrines you must believe in because if you believe in those doctrines, in that case, you will act accordingly in society. And when you act according to those doctrines, well, then that would sort of remedy the fact that you are not rational and will behave well on your own accord, but you will behave well. You will behave in the same way, but out of respect for the doctrines. So, and there are two kinds of doctrines here. There are what he calls the doctrines of universal faith, which is about basic religious doctrines about the existence of God and about, if you behave well, you will be rewarded in the afterlife and things like that, which are, from a Spinozist point of view, patently untrue. But it doesn't matter, because if you believe in those doctrines, it will make you behave in particular ways. The same thing for the political doctrines. There's actually only one. It's the doctrine that there is a social contract. And it has the exact same status. There is no social contract. But it's something that you will have to be taught in society in such a way, because if you believe that you have, just by being born into the society you're being born into, you have subscribed to a social contract that you must obey the civil laws. Well, if you have this social contract, you have this belief, then you will feel a duty towards the society, a civic duty towards the society to abide by the laws. So that even though you never signed up to any social contract, but you are being taught this, and you're being taught this in school. So I think there's something in Spinoza on the one hand when he says there's education. This education has sort of two aspects to it. On the one hand, there's something you have to learn, arts and sciences, that you have to learn content, and you will have to learn things that will help you become more rational and engage in rational discourse with others and develop your rationality and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there's also indoctrination in the sense of you're being taught doctrines. They are very minimal doctrines, but they are doctrines that you must believe in order for society to function. And why do you have to believe in them in order for society to function? Because those are the ones that, as it were, step in when your rationality can't keep up with your actions. When you are in a situation where you are not rational enough to know how you're supposed to behave, well, then you have the doctrines to lean on. So that's sort of back to the question of education again, just how important it is, because it has this, on the one hand, this arts and sciences that he gets from the humanist, and then there's a very strong Republican tradition for no, you have to be taught your civic duty and adhere to it, which is very important to realize.
Teaching civics becomes very important.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this true tire educational program. So, but there is, but I can see there's a commentary from Dan about that. This is exactly the program for general education of the sort that Hobbes advances in the Leviathan. No, it's not.
We can leave Dan to ask it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. There are actually two questions. The first, I think, is for Professor Nadler, and then was Professor Garber replying to that. So maybe we should start from the beginning.
Yeah, actually, it wasn't so much a question. So I was suggesting that, in terms of education, and I think Dan's right to point out that Spinoza doesn't turn this into a general program, but for Spinoza, the free person, that is the free, rational, and virtuous person, will recognize that it's in their own best interest to educate others and to do what they can to bring them to the life of reason, as to the best of their ability. So Dan, you can just say what your response to that was.
Yeah, my response is that that's not the kind of general program that one finds in the Leviathan. In the Leviathan, Hobbes offers, first of all, a critique of philosophy and a reform of university philosophy, which he thinks is important for civic purposes as well. He thinks that the Aristotelian philosophy actually undermines the kind of politics that he's arguing for. But he also has a general idea of reforming the universities, teaching political doctrines of the sort that he's advancing in the Leviathan to the people who will then become the teachers of other people. He, in fact, even suggests that, as he says, just as the Jews would gather once a week to read the law, people should gather once a week to be taught the doctrines of the Leviathan. And he wasn't kidding. He thought that it was for the stability of the state, people had to understand how the state was founded, how it had to be organized to promote stability, because stability ultimately is what it is that brings the advantages of the civil state over the state of nature. And one can read the Leviathan as, in part, of course, a political book, but it's also a book about the reform of the university system and the educational system.
And Spinoza mavens love to speculate on what the democracy chapters in the political treatise would have said had he lived to say them. And I'd like to think that he would have had something in there on educating citizens in democracy on Republican virtues and how to bring them to be good democratic citizens.
And that would be exactly parallel, I think, to what it is that Hobbes was trying to do in the Leviathan.
Yeah. I think that's a good suggestion. I mean, I hadn't really thought about where Spinoza might have wanted to write about education, but that would certainly seem to be the appropriate place when you came to those chapters in the teaching. Can I just one remark on the comparison with Hobbes? I mean, I think there's important comparisons with Hobbes where you can learn something about what Spinoza had in mind. It's true, as we said before, Spinoza doesn't have a general program, but I think he wanted to have a general program. And we can learn an awful lot by looking at Hobbes, not just by saying maybe Spinoza, he wanted something similar, but also through there's a sort of a very nice systematic contrast between the kind of educational systems that you would expect them to envisage. If you look at Hobbes's educational program, it's very characteristic by being it is extremely state controlled, and it is very hierarchical. It goes from the sovereign, and then the sovereign. He says these things. The sovereign is actually the one who should educate everybody, but he doesn't have the time, so he delegates to university professors, and university professors don't have the time to do anything, so they will teach other people. And these people, those are all the the little village priests and little dignitaries who will sort of go out in the English countryside and teach in the villages. And we need to keep that in a very short leash. We have to be very careful about how we do this. We have to keep very close state control of that. Why? Because he's responding to a particular kind of situation here after the mid 18th century and the Civil War and things like that. And he's particularly been particularly upset about the fact that the theologians who during the Civil War in Oxford and Cambridge, who sort of sat there and started to set up a parallel state by sending their little minions out in the countryside and teaching them all kinds of seditious doctrines. So Hobbes's educational program has this very strict hierarchical state control character to it. And what he thinks is that you should basically teach Hobbes's philosophy because then it's good, Spinoza, if you look at what Spinoza, we would expect from Spinoza, and we try to correlate with what it is that he wants to achieve and what people in the context around him were discussing in terms of education, you will come up with a very different image. You'll come up with a educational system which is not at all state controlled, actually. It would be an educational system which is, let's say, in terms of finances and things like that, it's more like the public church in Holland at the time, which was the idea that it is doctrinally and say from its internal organization and function quite independent from the state. The state just puts on offer its support in terms of finances and buildings and things like that. But then otherwise, within these, this is a system of what Van den Enden calls explicitly community colleges. You have little colleges out in the villages, in the little towns, where you have people who will gather together and they will discuss among each other, and they will not discuss any particular philosophy. They will not talk about the Leviathan. They will not talk about the TTP. They will just sit and just discuss with each other. And there's supposed to be no hierarchy at all. Professors can't even call each other professors. So this is a little bit extreme in Van den Enden, but I think this is the kind of educational reform that Spinoza he was envisaging. Why? Because he has this commitment to the idea that if you have a very broad public sphere of well-educated citizens, well, in that case, then the society is in a good shape where you can start to instaurate a kind of state form which would be a democracy, where everybody can, as it were, occupy every societal role, as it were. And he basically has three societal roles for people, is that they can be citizens, they can be sovereigns, and they can be counselors, which is a very humanist idea. Before the counselors were privy counselors, Spinoza takes the humanist theory of say, counsel to the sovereign and makes it into a theory. He broadens it out and makes it into a theory of democratic participation. So you have sort of a three-tier political system where you have, citizens, counselors, and sovereigns. And what is characteristic for a democracy, a participatory democracy, is that everyone can occupy, not at the same time, of course, but everyone can occupy all the roles. And that fact that things circulate in that way among the sort of gives on a well-functioning democracy, a particular kind of stability that he wants. But in order for that to function, you need to have a class of counselors that are worth consulting and who follow the rules. And that's what civic education is there for. It is there to make sure that people are educated so that they can take up this role as being counselors to the sovereign powers. So yeah, and that is basically what a public sphere is. The public sphere is a place where everybody discusses with each other and educate each other, while you have the sovereign listening with one ear and trying to learn from it. So that's sort of the ideal he's looking for. I think.
Maybe I could just insert here one question about obedience,
Yes.
and then we have two other questions. One is on YouTube. So then we have two other questions on the natural law, and the other one was on so the other one was on the social context. So firstly, my question would be, so one thing that I think stands out in the Tractatus theologico-politicus when you read it is that there is one passage that repeats itself maybe at least 2 times, and it's the one I think it is at the beginning of at the end of the preface and at the end of the whole book, at the end of chapter 12, where Spinoza says that he is ready to submit his thinking to the authorities. And if there is anything which goes against the public good, that is well, he wish his whole treatise unsaid.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe could you say something about why does he say this? Is it sort of applying his own method to himself, to his own démarche, something among the signs?
Yeah, I think so. So I think it speaks to what we said in the beginning about the limitations that Spinoza he puts upon the permission to speak freely. When we get to the chapter 20, you say everybody should be permitted to say what to think what they will and say what they think. They should be permitted to do that. And then after that, he puts on some restrictions on that this permission does not extend to certain situations. Now, what I think, so what I said before that was that these restrictions were not about so much about content as they are about context. That it is not so much about not being something that you're not permitted to say, but it's somewhere where you're not permitted to say it. Now, one of the important things about the place where you are permitted to say it is that it is exactly a public sphere, and it must be so that the sovereign should be allowed to listen in on it. It's be a place. If you say something in there, it's made. I think these final remarks is sort of a gesture towards the idea that when you engage in free philosophizing or public speech in the way that I think that he thinks about free philosophizing as a kind of public speech, that this public speech, that if it goes private and you do not address it to the sovereign at the same time, that when you are doing public speech, you are addressing yourself to interlocutors, but also to the sovereign powers at the same time. That if you don't do that, if you cut off one channel, it's not legitimate anymore. You're no longer within the right sphere, as it were. So I think it's a gesture towards that. And now I know that you are listening here, he's saying to the sovereign.
So before going to the question I have on YouTube, I think Denis Dakchi had a question for quite some time now. You have to unmute. Yeah.
I was okay. I had a couple questions, but I don't know if I'll get to them all. One is, since this came up just now, with respect to the content of what is said might not be restricted, but where it is said might be restricted. I mean, Spinoza does explicitly call certain opinions seditious in chapter 20, and those have to do with that the supreme power doesn't have it's the supreme right, and people have freedom to act completely on their own, and these he restricts in chapter 20, I believe. So there is something in the content of at least with those wherever said, at least from what I understand, he doesn't restrict them to it. If these are said in certain contexts, that's okay, but they shouldn't be taken outside of that. At least I'm not seeing that move in chapter 20 with respect to those explicit doctrines. There could be implicit doctrines which, if followed through reasoning, would lead to that, and that might be worked out in the public sphere perhaps, but explicit rejection of the authority of the sovereign is not permitted.
Yeah, I actually think you're right about that. I think it has got to do with sometimes sometimes you will see scholars who would insist much on Spinoza, who makes sort of a distinction between speaking and acting. That you can say whatever you want, but you can't do whatever you want to do. I don't think that's exactly the right distinction to make. The right distinction to make would rather be, well, it is speaking and acting, but all speaking is also acting. So everything you say also has an aspect of acting to it. It has consequences, what you say. Now, I think there are certain kinds of speech that there are certain things that you say that can hardly be considered where you can't abstract from the acting bit, which can only be considered actions almost. Let's say, I mean, like he gives the example when you speak up against the civil sovereign, and it's not something that shocks us particularly. But look at, for example, how it is today when say the New York Times, they publish an op-ed by Tom Cotton, a senator, who incites to violence. Now, a week after, the New York Times, they say, "Oh, we shouldn't have published that." And they give sort of a mea culpa because of that. I actually think they're right about that, and I think also on Spinoza's views, they might be right about that, because that kind of speech falls entirely outside the, let's say, the rules of engagement. That not just the rules, say it doesn't just fall outside the rules of engagement for free philosophizing. It falls out philosophizing altogether. When you're doing free philosophizing, well, if you're not educated, well, you might deceive, you might be prejudiced, there might be all kinds of problems, but you're still philosophizing in the sense that you are engaging with people in a discursive way. And it is possible to, when you speak in that way, people can extract that, they can judge about what you say, whichever way they want. So that's the first rule. Your interlocutor has the right to judge as they want about what you say. However, if someone goes out and then says, "You go and shoot all the Democrats," or whatever he was on about, well, what's going on here is that he's not at all speaking. He's just producing actions, and that falls not just outside. It's not just not free philosophizing. It's not philosophizing at all.
It's an incitement to violence. Explicit incitement to violence isn't engaging in reasoning.
It's not just not engaging reasoning, but it's not at all engaging other people in a discursive mode. It's just acting upon them. It's already doing violence. Mm-hmm. So, and that, of course, is not permitted because it doesn't fall within public engagement. So,
now, a second question I had was about what might be the content of Spinoza's education. I believe, if I didn't misunderstand, that this would include the doctrines of universal faith. Mm-hmm. Did I understand that correctly? That you were suggesting that would be something that would be taught?
Yes. Yes. So
that's what I want to ask about. Now I have a question. If that is what you actually said. Now, one issue is, by his lights, it turns out that these are unlikely to be true. At least all of them can be given some sort of interpretation according to which what they say is true by Spinoza's lights. So those who have been taught will not end up with some truths, but what they'll be is they'll get good behavior, they'll be obedient to, and they'll be living in a peaceful society as a result. So they benefit from it clearly. But this is done for not the sake of teaching them truths, but to teach them obedience. Mm-hmm. So one might think that, well, it might serve a purpose in that respect, but it's not necessarily teaching them people falsehoods might not make them comfortable or being in a position where you are in a position to not to know that this is false, but to teach them to others, and then expect them to come to a later point, at least some of them, to say that, well, you've been teaching the truth, you know, this wasn't true. So that's one might think is going to create a conflict within the education, if this is part of a public education. I think instead that this is something that he allows to be taught in churches. This is not part of a public educational. Well, schools might be teaching this, but this will be some sort of religion will be going on within the states, even under Spinoza's provisions. And what they'll be taught in churches is this. This is what they'll get out of scripture. You don't need to be taught scripture necessarily in Spinoza's schools. You might be teach grammar and all that, the liberal arts, but not necessarily those contents, one might think. So he's going to allow freedom of religion of some sort, and he's going to allow those people engaged in that professionally to teach these doctrines, but they might not be part of the educational program.
So you might be right. I mean, I don't know. It's very hard to say how as far as it can be reconstructed, whether sort of a program say a program of education on a Spinozist way would include religious education, as it were. Let's say primary and even secondary education in Holland at the time was enormously dominated by catechism and by religious education, and it's hard to know exactly how far he would take in sort of taking it out. He might, as you say, have thought that the questions of religion and the teaching of doctrine should not happen in schools, but should happen from the pulpits in one way or another. I don't know. I think you might be right about that.
There's something that Van den Enden says. Is that how he imagines communal?
Van den Enden doesn't say much about religion at all in this context. Also, he doesn't have a doctrine. He doesn't have doctrines of universal faith and all that sort of stuff. He's basically just an atheist. So, but the one thing sort of that I worry a little about is the idea that it is that you said it is allowed to be taught in the churches. I think it's crucial for Spinoza that these doctrines are taught. It's not just a question of allowing. It's a question of they has to be taught. I mean, whether it's from the pulpits or whether it's from the classroom, I guess that might not matter that much. But it has to be taught, because if people do not adhere to these doctrines, well, it would be mayhem. Because now it has something to do with the way what the problem was in the Dutch Republic at the time, and what the problem was with religious freedom. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what religious freedom was from the Dutch. I mean, there's always the idea that people think that what they wanted was religious freedom in the sense that they didn't want the state to interfere with their religion. But that's not what religious freedom is about in the Dutch Republic at all. The state never wanted to interfere with that. That's not the problem. The problem was that they wanted religious freedom from other citizens. They didn't want the Catholics didn't want the Calvinists to kill them, and the Calvinists didn't want the other sects to kill them. The problem was not the state intervening in their religious freedom; it was other citizens intervening in their religious freedom. So that was the problem. And so what Spinoza had to devise was a mechanism, a doctrinal mechanism that had to be taught, so people could be taught not to be at each other's throats because they had different religions. And the doctrines of universal faith is a key part of that mechanism for ensuring religious pluralism. I mean, there's often this idea that Spinoza, you see some commentators recently who would say that Spinoza's doctrines of universal faith is a sort of religious Stalinism or something like that. That is just sort of, but that's not what it is. I mean, what he's giving with the doctrines of universal faith is that he gives a minimal, he doesn't give a minimal religion, what everything that everybody should believe, and then they shouldn't believe anything else. He's giving a minimal definition of religion. So he says, everything that is a religion, there can be all sorts of things, but it must integrate at least this. If it doesn't have this, it's not a religion. All religions must, and if you can teach people this, then they can believe whatever they want. And he even says that people should believe other things. As long as they subscribe to those things, they can add whatever they want. Indeed, they should add whatever they want. Why? Because he's very sensitive to the fact that people have different mindsets, as he says, or different mentalities. That people have different people will be motivated by different kinds of religious doctrine to live according to religion, to obey true religion. So people will add all sorts of things to these 7 doctrines of universal faith, and they have to figure out for themselves privately what kind of
minimal, but it appears that it is some sort of Christianity, especially in the latter parts of the.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry to jump in. We are approaching actually the end of our discussion, and there are a number of questions. And I thought we might take one from the YouTube. Alex, do you want to read that?
Yes, okay. So we have one question from Katarina Peixoto, and I will just read it out loud. So she says, could you tell what is the conception of natural law as it is in the Tractatus theologico-politicus, and what, if any, is the scope of social contract regarding freedom of philosophy in this work?
So the conception of natural law in Spinoza is very straightforward. You have the right to do whatever you can do and what you want to do. So it doesn't really go, and you can do, you can do what you have the right to do, what you have the power to do, and it doesn't go any further than that. Now, how that applies to the question of freedom of philosophizing is kind of interesting, because the way that Spinoza sees freedom of philosophizing is that freedom of philosophizing is a public sphere that sort of shows up within civil society. So when we have natural right, when you have in a state of natural right, then you establish civil society, because people de facto come together and decide that it is in their common, sort of on a basic of a minimal rationality, that is in their common interest to come together and live a communal life and be together and decide on rules of living together. They will do that. I mean, that's basically the genesis of the state from Spinoza, from natural right, is that that people will come together out of sort of minimal rational self-interest. It's the kind of doctrine that he, or the kind of theory of natural right that he will develop in the Tractatus Politicus. But what then happens is that when you get to, once you have established a civil society, what is it that you can do in order to ensure that people who are within a civil society continue to adhere to it, that people don't just drop out all the time? What is it that keep people together? If you have set up a rationally decided, they will put together, the people in sort of momentary lapses of rationality decide not to adhere to societal norms. You have to set in mechanisms to do that, and that's what you do with a social contract. You teach people that is a social contract, and they have to sign up to that. They have signed up to that by simply being born. Now, that means that whole civil society is governed by, on the one hand, by an established common interest, and on the other hand, by a doctrine or a sense of duty towards that common interest. But within that civil society, what then happens is that there's one corner of it where there's something that you cannot give up. There's something that you cannot give up. You're natural there is a social contract, means that you give over your power so the state must so the state can manage your power for you, as it were. But there are powers that you cannot give up. And the power that you cannot give up is twofold in Spinoza. It is, on the one hand, it is your power of judgment, and it is, on the other hand, it is your power of expressing that judgment. You cannot not judge for yourself if you have the power to it, and you cannot not say what you judge. You will speak out. So that is the very basic foundation of the public sphere for him, is that it is a place within civil society where there's a pocket of within a civil society where natural right still rules, and that's free philosophizing. That's where natural right still rules within civil society.
Wonderful. And this brings us to the end of our discussion, because it's already 10 o'clock in Romania.
Okay.
I would like first to thank Mogens and everyone else for this fantastic discussion. It was really a pleasure to have you here. Clearly, what we have to do is to go and read more Spinoza. One lesson of tonight is that education is the key to unlock freedom of philosophizing. And we still have problems, how to translate this into today's world, what kind of education do we need, and how to reform education, and so on. Philosophy After Dark is a weekly venue, but we are going to do it in English every second week. So follow us for the program, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and let me, invite you to join into thanking Mogens for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.